Okay guys, so I've got another disclaimer. Babies are getting to their 4.5 week mark, which means we're going to be separating them by sex fairly soon, but it also means that we had to put a wheel in and add a few other bits of entertainment for them because they're getting to be closer to being adult rats, even if they're not fully grown and mature. So you might hear even more strange background noises, which if you watch the New Bridge, you're probably used to them by now, but in terms of recording, I'm gonna do my best to remove them, but you might hear some squeaking or some creaking or banging around. That's the babies in the cage, and there's not a lot I can do about it until a couple days from now. So, with that out of the way, I'll admit that when I first came to this week's topic, I had a lot of preconceptions. Namely because during my Wiccan phase, I explored ceremonial magic and other magical traditions while still trying to find myself, and there's a very specific view of magic that comes from that. But I was surprised. Some things I believed were validated, but many were not, and ancient magic actually looked very different than what many modern occultists practice. So, what was magic in ancient Greece according to modern scholars? Let's take a look. Karate! Shout out this week to Ikeda Hakubi for picking up the book Public and Private in the Ancient Mediterranean for me off my wishlist. It's going to be really important for me when exploring legal stuff later this year, and it means a lot that you supported the channel. The message attached said, "Thank you for setting my minds at ease in the Discord, and you're very welcome. The Zany Bridge Discord is an allyship space where people can learn and grow. Link is in the description for folks who'd like to check it out. Thank you again for your support." Magic is a contentious topic in Hellenism, to say the least. Many boards ban discussion of geisha, which is another word for harmful or baneful magic. But, as I found digging around in scholarly materials, magic wasn't defined contemporaneously the way we do today. Oracles of the gods were commonplace, but divination under the modern Christian lens is considered a form of magic and therefore evil. Ritual offerings and prayers in the modern day, the ones that Hellenists engage in regularly in the hopes of procuring blessings from the gods, look a lot like spells and formulae to the untrained eye. And though many Hellenists and other pagans would claim that magic attempts to coerce the gods or subvert them entirely, this is not actually true of most of the ancient magic I've been able to find information on. I'm gonna caveat at the beginning that I no longer feel the need to practice magic in my own worship, and haven't since I became a Hellenist. The cycle of Catus with the gods feels strong enough to me personally that I don't feel the need to perform spells, but I do view magic as a valid practice. And as we'll see, it goes back into ancient times, in Egypt and in Greece, and even if in Greece among the educated elite and therefore the eyes of many writers we reference for our faith, it might not have been seen in the most positive light. It's a respectable practice for occultists and Hellenists alike, and if they choose to engage in it, it's between them and the gods. It's not my place to tell someone else how to worship or practice. Alright, caveat 2 out of the way, let's take a look at magic from a scholarly perspective. How do we define magic in the ancient Greek world? The first source I dug into came from Radcliffe Edmonds III, Drawing Down the Moon, Magic in the Greco-Roman World. This is going to be my main source for this video because it is just such a thorough look at the concept of magic and even how it's defined. Edmonds first debunks one of the misconceptions I had by tackling the so-called coercive language of magical formulae as a potential defining trait of magic versus religious practice. Most ancient spells, he states, look a lot like normal prayers, and many contain symbolic, if not very specific, offerings. He starts by looking at contemporaries of those accused of writing spells or casting them in court, and the main commonality we found here was that magic was non-normative religious practice in some way, meaning practice outside of what those at the time considered to be acceptable and normal. One such way in which practice could be non-normative had to do with who was performing the rite. The book's title, Drawing Down the Moon, alludes to the idea that women in Thessaly were capable of pulling the moon down from the sky and harvesting moon foam for diabolical purposes. Subverting the gods' rule over the cycles of night and day was definitively non-normative, even though many writers of the time also proposed various ways in which they believed the charlatans and hacks who would deceive folks into believing this was possible. The explanations ranged from advanced astronomical knowledge, where the witch would predict when an eclipse would happen and then fool people into believing that she caused it, to using a tricky system of mirrors and pulleys to make it look like the moon had risen and the room and was shining for the onlookers. The second way in which it could be non heteronormative was the how, namely outside of prescribed festivals and often with means that look rather strange to modern eyes. Secret names of the gods being uttered, nonsense syllables, pyramid-shaped word structures removing a single letter from either side, etc. were performed in spell work, all of which were believed to have various magical functions. The last way was perceived efficacy, in which the magic was considered to be much higher than traditional worship. The spell gave the caster a secret special in with the gods, or created an effect despite them. Ritualistic and symbolic actions and ingredients, often taken from normative religion and employed in a unique formulae, are used to create a presumed uncanny level of success. This is another interesting point that I dug into in a bit more detail. What differentiates magic prayer from traditional ritual? According to Edmonds, it had to do with a deviation in structure. In my video on prayer, link in the iCard if you missed it, I talked at length about the tripartite structure of prayer: invocation, argument, and request. The argument portion of most ancient prayers focused on the long cycle of charis, often since birth, between the worshipper and the gods. Charis, by the way, is a Greek word for reciprocity. I covered more of it on my video on offerings, link in the iCard above. Give because I have given prayers focused on the offerings given in the past. Give because I give focused on the present. If ever I have given focuses on the past when an offering is unavailable in the present, and give so I can give in the future was used in desperate times when a whole city or house was under threat. And give because you have given focuses on what gods have done in the past for the worshipper or in myth for other worshippers. The argument potion in most spells, however, especially those in the Greek Magical Papyri, is substituted by the magical formulae and secret names. Instead of focusing on a cycle established between the worshipper and a god, the secret knowledge is thought to forge an immediate bond with them, one that pleases the gods simply because the knowledge was possessed by the magician. Edmonds cites a particular spell for this point, addressed to Hermes, in which invokes a number of secret names and ideas. I'm gonna do my best to pronounce them in a Homeric style, even though these were likely written in Koine. Your names in heaven, Lampten, Uthti, Uastin, Oti, Omenot, and Tomuk. These are the names in the four quarters of heaven. I also know what your forms are. In the east you have the form of an ibis, in the west you have the form of a dog-faced baboon, in the north you have the form of a serpent, in the south you have the form of a wolf. Your plant is the grape, which is the olive, and I also know your wood, ebony. I know you, Hermes, you who are and where you came from, and what your home city is, Hermopolis. The spell goes on with a number of sacred ideas and numbers attributed to Hermes, declaring at the end, I know you, Hermes, and you know me. I am you, and you are I. And so, do everything for me, and may you turn to me with good fortune and good daimon. Immediately, quickly. These names and ideas, Edmonds states, take the place of charis because this divine, secret knowledge pleases the gods even more so than traditional offerings would. He also notes that in many spells, the name of a god seemingly higher in the divine hierarchy is used to coerce supposedly lower powers. Another spell he gives from the papyri uses the names of a so-called high god to scare a nekyodaimon, or the spirit of a dead person not yet laid to rest, into doing what they say. The rationale being that the person who knows the secret names of higher entities must therefore have a strong relationship with them, and it would do fall for the nekyodaimon to obey. Secret names and formulae, according to the papyri themselves, were purportedly given to humans to allow for folks to have the special bond with deities, and thereby get the things they want or need. Edmonds debunks the idea that these spells were mostly used for nefarious purposes, noting that in the magical papyri, many of these spells were actually said to create many sorts of miracles and positive blessings for folks who would ask for them openly in temples. The secret formulae created an expectation of extreme efficacy, with many spells having a kinder version like the Hermes spell above, and a more coercive version with gross offerings that smelled terrible and would attempt to create a commanding relationship between the magician and the god. So, what forms did these spells take in ancient times? A number of them were written spells, particularly the curse tablets or katadesmoi, which were so common and well studied from the 4th century BC onward that I'm going to give them their own video. For now, I'll quote that the majority of them were used in legal proceedings to try and use the dead to bind someone's ability to speak against an opponent in court, or to try and stop rumors and the like, though they were said to command the dead to do many other things as well. In other words, they were just about always used for competitive and nefarious purposes, and were usually made of lead and pierced or broken in some way. Erotic spells were very common among katadesmoi as well, according to Edmonds, especially those to restrain rivals of affection during courtship. However, in the romantic realm, the most common spells appeared to be those aimed at conception and pregnancy, purported to guarantee that the effects of a couple to bear heirs would be successful. During an era where most babies didn't make it into their second year, the appeal of these sorts of spells is obvious. In addition to curse tablets, various herbal concoctions were used, including cooking a hyena's eye in anise and consuming it within 3 days, or using the sinews and kidney with red wine and incense to stop fertility damaged by a curse. So-called retaining spells, or those intended to preserve an existing relationship between people, seem to have primarily been aimed by women at men, whereas obtaining spells, or those attempting to create the effects of eros in their objects, seem to primarily be aimed at women by men. If you guys are interested in a future video on the concept of eros and all of the various physical symptoms that came with that, let me know in the comments below. This is a huge topic and I'm not going to be able to get too deep into it here. Both types of spells often came in the form of curse tablets, attempting to bind a rival or inflict the emotions the magician desired upon the object of their affection. In the 1st century CE, there was a spell that specifically made use of an apple thrown at a target of one's affections to create these feelings of eros within them. To whichever woman I give or whichever woman I throw this at, setting everything aside, may be she mad for my love. Whether she takes it in her hand or eats it or sets it in her bosom, may she never stop loving me. O Lady Culpogenia, bring to perfection this perfect incantation. It states. Edmonds notes that the apple was a symbol of fertility given to women on their wedding nights and traditional ceremonies, and was sometimes used by prostitutes to catch the attention of potential prospects. So this is an example of a normative symbol that was reclassified for a magical intent. Here, the symbolism combines with the prayer and the sacred invocation of a name with a request for a guarantee of success at the end in the form of a prayer. Other spells that purported to inflict eros included those using effigies of the women being targeted, which were often pierced with copper rods in 13 places, with lead tablets entreating her to remember the magician alone and forget rivals, and various charms which claimed that if you gave them to your target, they would inflict horrendous, torturous obsession upon them until they came to your bed. Charming. Given the sorts of spells I've seen in some parts of the occult community, it seems some things never change, though I will note that spells of this sort are generally considered deeply unethical in the modern day, and those who cast them are said to suffer lashback from doing so. Healing and protective spells were also very common, many of which took the form of amulets or small protective charms that would be carried with the person who cast or requested the spell, and incantations which could be used on their own for healing and were often paired with amulets for their protection. Examples Edmonds gives of protective and healing amulets include one found with images of grapes, which was said to protect against upper respiratory infections because the uvula hung in the back of the throat like a bunch of grapes, and another with a reaper standing behind a grain thresher meant to protect against sciatica, because grain threshing puts a lot of pressure on the sciatic nerve and could in the long term create chronic pain in that area. In the Odyssey 19:455 through 458, Homer tells the story of Odysseus going hunting with his uncles and getting gored by a boar. His uncles bind up the wound and sing incantations over the wound to cause it to heal. So it seems that singing incantations, at least during Homer's days, was normative, but in the 4th century BC and later, the Hippocratic school began decrying traditional methods of healing as charlatanry, and as such, they fell into the realm of magic. Astrology, various divinatory practices outside of temple grounds, and eventually Neoplatonic theurgy all make their appearance in the Hellenistic era and later. There's so much on all of them that if you want to hear about any of these other types of magic, let me know down in the comments. As per usual, the topic is gargantuan, and trying to cover it all in one video is far too much. This, however, does bring us to the crucial question. How were these practices seen in ancient times? Well, it depends on who you ask. The Greek Magical Papyri, due to the mix of Demotic Greek, Latin, and Hebrew that they were found in, were most likely composed by Egyptian priests, because they were the most likely to have fluency in all of those languages. The spells themselves appear primarily to serve a rich clientele, likely aristocrats who could afford to pay extravagancy for a high chance of success. In earlier times, especially in Attica, although there were no laws against magic directly, there were laws against pharmakon, or the materials and products of spells which could potentially cause harm. Those accused of using pharmakon were often women accused of harming husbands or rivals for their affections, but sometimes men were accused as well. Asabia, or impiety, was another charge leveled at suspected sorcerers, or goes, and the supposed spell work was often brought up in courts when asabia charges were leveled. Though, given the litany of evidence we have of curse tablets and the like from the Hellenistic era onwards, magic only became a problem for someone when other problems surfaced, and the average person seemed to have no problem using it when situations got dire. The educated elite, many of whom would be making arguments in court or writing the works that survived to inform us of Hellenic culture, seem to largely have a negative view of magic, but that's not always indicative of the view of the average Greek. So, should a Hellenist practice magic? Magic in ancient times looked quite a bit different in many ways from the sort of spells that one could pluck off the shelf at Barnes & Noble in the modern day. The practice Practice itself is a personal decision, and the era and deities you honor, along with the experience of them, should inform your choice. One thing that is important for the Hellenic community as a whole is to stop being dicks to those who choose to practice magic in a respectful way as a part of their worship. We have no proof that the spells and formulae of old were not given to humans by the gods as another mode of worship, any more than we have proof that the gods exist at all beyond our own experience of them and the experiences of our ancestors of faith. Judging someone else for their relationship with the gods when it has no bearing on your own just fractures the community further when we already have a hard enough time with the constant attacks by fundamentalists and anti-theists. Why should we attack each other too? This doesn't mean don't criticize obviously harmful practices like these so-called flying ointments that contain toxic substances. It just means the practice of magic itself might not be as modern as we'd like to think, and we don't necessarily know that the gods take offense to this particular mode of interaction with them. I would advise that, from a Reconstructionist perspective, ancient magic does appear to pair with offerings more often than not, and was done in a respectful manner toward the gods rather than commanding. So if you're concerned about history, incorporating these aspects into your practice would likely be beneficial. Anyway, thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here and you learned something interesting, bewitch the subscribe button and sound the bell that the curetes may cleanse the channel with their music. Drop down into the comments and let me know if magic is a part of your practice, how important it is or not, or just tell me that I'm a blasphemer and promoting Asabia views if that's your speed. Special thanks to GaelicNox, links in the description to their Twitter and website as always, and special thanks to my patrons. You all keep the lights on at the channel and ensure that I can get good scholarly resources like Drawing Down the Moon and Curse Tablets and Blinding Spells, as well as maintain my monthly maintenance costs. Without you all, it would be far harder for me to keep the schedule that I need in order to put out these videos every single week. I hope the cycle of reciprocity between us remains positive for you all. And remember, we're stronger together.